Girl murdered by her aunt returns from death with the truth. The house stood silent in the aftermath of the storm, a dilapidated monument to broken dreams and unanswered questions. A heavy fog had rolled in, thick and suffocating, wrapping the home in a cloak of isolation. The windows, fogged from the chill, offered no glimpse of the world outside. Inside, the family gathered, each one weighed down by the shared trauma of their past. They sat in the dim glow of a single lamp, the room heavy with the tension of what had been lost. The anniversary of her death. It had been 5 years since young Emily had been taken from them, murdered in cold blood by someone who was supposed to protect her. Her aunt, Valerie, had always been the one closest to her, the one who should have shielded her from harm. But it wasn't Valerie who had been left with the answers. It wasn't Valerie who had found the girl's body in the garden that day. The only thing Valerie was left with was the shame of the unanswered questions, the haunting notion that maybe, just maybe, she had known too little. Or worse, maybe she had known too much. "I don't like this," Valerie whispered, clutching a picture of Emily that had been taken just days before her murder. She turned the photo over and over in her hands, as though looking for some clue, some hint of where everything had gone wrong. "What's bothering you now?" asked Robert, her brother, his voice terse. His face was drawn, tired. He hadn't slept in days, and the bags under his eyes were deep enough to tell 1,000 stories of restless nights. "Emily's dead. What are we still doing here?" Valerie stiffened. "This house, it doesn't feel right anymore. It's like she's still here." She shivered, though the room was warm, the air thick and stifling. "It's as if something's watching us." Her mother, Marie, sat on the other side of the room, her eyes vacant, staring at the old rocking chair that used to be Emily's. "The doctors said it was grief," Marie muttered, almost to herself. "That's all it was." "Grief?" Robert scoffed. "Don't make excuses. Grief doesn't leave stains on the walls. Grief doesn't leave bloody footprints behind." He stood up abruptly, pacing the room. He stopped when he reached the window, his gaze drifting to the view outside. The street was empty, save for a few passing cars and the occasional pedestrian trudging through the mist. Grief doesn't leave us wondering what the hell happened to Emily. The silence in the room deepened. No one could bring themselves to speak the words aloud. No one wanted to admit the truth they all felt in their bones. Emily's murder had been no accident. Whoever had done it was still out there. Still watching. Still waiting. Then the doorbell rang. The sound was sudden, sharp, and it shattered the quiet like a glass breaking against the floor. The entire family jumped, their gazes snapping toward the door. Who could it be? It was late. Too late for anyone to be calling on them. Valerie stood first, her hand trembling as she reached for the door handle. She hesitated for a moment, as if trying to will herself to open it. With a reluctant breath, she pulled the door open. Standing on the porch, drenched from the rain, was a man none of them had seen before. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed carved out of stone. He wore a long, dark coat that flapped in the wind, the collar turned up against the cold. His presence was imposing, yet there was something about him that radiated authority. Something unsettling. "Can I help you?" Valerie asked, trying to mask the unease in her voice. The man's eyes narrowed as he studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, without introducing himself, he spoke. "I'm here to investigate the murder of Emily Grant." The words hit them like a physical blow. For a moment, no one spoke. The family stood frozen, their faces drained of color. "What do you mean?" Robert asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "The case was closed years ago." "Who are you?" The man's gaze shifted, briefly scanning the interior of the home. "I'm not here to discuss the case," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "I'm here to ask questions that haven't been asked before. And I'm here to uncover the truth." Valerie recoiled, her mind racing. The truth? What truth? Was he implying they hadn't done enough? That the investigation had been a farce? The man seemed to read her mind. "This isn't about the police investigation. It's about what you know, what you didn't see, what you missed." The words struck Valerie like a hammer. She took a step back, instinctively pulling the door further open. "What do you know?" she demanded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to know. She had to understand. The man stepped forward, his expression solemn, his eyes unwavering. I know that Emily's death wasn't an accident. And I know that you've all been living with the weight of something darker than you realize. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photo of Emily. But it wasn't just any photo. It was one she hadn't seen before. It was taken from a different angle, one that showed a shadowy figure standing behind Emily, a figure she couldn't recognize. "Who is this?" Valerie whispered, her breath catching in her throat. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he simply let the photo hang in the air between them. "I have my suspicions," he said slowly, "but I need your help to understand what really happened." Robert stepped forward, his face a mixture of anger and fear. "Why should we trust you?" The man's eyes darkened. "Because I'm your only chance to find out what happened to Emily. Your only chance to uncover the truth before it's too late." Valerie felt her heart beat faster. Something about this man felt wrong. Something about the way he spoke. But she couldn't ignore the unease in her chest, the feeling that everything in their lives was about to be turned upside down. "Come inside," Valerie said quietly, stepping aside. She had no idea who this man was or what he knew, but deep down, she knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to leave until the truth was uncovered. And whatever that truth was, it was going to change everything. As the man stepped inside, the chill of the night air seemed to follow him, clinging to the edges of his coat. The door slammed shut behind him with a dull thud that reverberated throughout the house. For a long moment, no one spoke. Valerie, Robert, and Marie stood motionless, their eyes fixed on the stranger in the middle of the room. His presence was heavy, like an uninvited guest at a funeral, something neither welcomed nor fully understood. "I'm sure you have questions," the man finally said, his voice breaking the silence like the crack of thunder. "I'll answer them when I can, but first, I need you to understand the gravity of what's happening here." Valerie couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread coil in her stomach. She looked at Robert, but he was just as confused as she was. Marie, on the other hand, had barely moved since the man entered. Her hands were trembling, clasped tightly in her lap, her face drained of color. "What do you know about Emily's death?" Valerie asked, her voice almost a whisper. "We've been through this, we've suffered, she's gone. The police said it was an accident. That's the end of it." The man's expression remained unmoved. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach churn. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a small, worn notebook, flipping it open with ease. His fingers skimmed the pages for a moment before he met Valerie's gaze once more. "I know that Emily's death was no accident," he said slowly, deliberately. "And I know that someone in this room is hiding the truth." The words hung in the air like a poisoned arrow. Valerie felt her breath catch in her throat. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Who's hiding the truth?" The man's gaze shifted to Robert. He had barely spoken since entering, his face a mask of disbelief. Robert took a step forward, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "We did everything we could. We tried to move on. We tried to forget, but you keep showing up with all these threats and accusations. What do you want from us?" The stranger didn't flinch. His gaze never wavered from Robert as he spoke. "I don't want anything from you. But you're going to have to face the fact that you're all involved in this somehow." His eyes flicked to Marie, whose gaze was cast downward, as if she were avoiding the confrontation. "All of you." The tension in the room thickened, suffocating them all. Valerie could feel her pulse quicken as she desperately tried to make sense of the situation. This wasn't about Emily's death anymore. This was about something far more sinister. "Why are you saying these things?" Valerie demanded. "You can't just come in here and make accusations without proof. Who are you?" The man stood motionless, as if contemplating how best to respond. Finally, he broke the silence. "My name is Vincent Gray," he said quietly. "And I know exactly what happened to Emily. I know who killed her, and I know why." There was a sharp intake of breath from Marie, and she finally looked up, her eyes wide with fear. No, this can't be. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. Vincent didn't look away. He held her gaze for a moment, then glanced at Robert. "I'm not accusing anyone directly yet," he said, his tone eerily calm. "But the truth is this: Emily's death was carefully orchestrated. And one of you in this room helped make it happen." The words fell heavily, echoing in the silence of the room. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. It felt as if the air itself had frozen, suspended in the space between them. "Why are you telling us this?" Robert asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why now? Why come here after all these years?" Vincent's expression softened slightly, but there was still an undeniable hardness in his eyes. "Because you need to know," he replied. "And because the time has come for you to understand exactly what's at stake. Emily's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a warning. And the truth about it will change everything." The weight of his words settled on the family like a dark cloud, hanging over them. Valerie's mind raced as she tried to piece together the puzzle. What did he mean? What was the truth he was talking about? She turned to Robert, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Do you understand any of this?" she whispered. Robert shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know what to believe anymore. I just want this nightmare to end. It's been 5 years and nothing's changed. We have to move on." But Valerie couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She couldn't explain it, but she knew deep down that Vincent's words weren't just words. They were a warning. Something was coming. Something they hadn't prepared for. "I'm not leaving until I have answers," Vincent said, his voice unwavering. "And you won't find peace until you face the truth. The truth about Emily's death, and the truth about what's been hidden in this house for far too long." The tension in the room grew unbearable, the silence stretching on as Valerie and Robert exchanged a glance. Marie was still seated, her face ashen, her hands now shaking uncontrollably. She had the look of someone who knew something, someone who had been keeping a secret for far too long. Finally, Valerie spoke. "What's hidden here, Vincent?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What don't we know?" Vincent's eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time since he'd entered the room, a faint hint of a smile crossed his lips. "You'll find out soon enough." With that, he turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Valerie stood frozen in place, the weight of his words still lingering in the air. The door slammed behind him, and they were left in the silence, with nothing but the sound of their own breathing filling the space. What was Vincent hiding? And, more importantly, what was he about to reveal? The door creaked shut behind Vincent, the echo of its closure reverberating through the house like a warning bell. Valerie stood motionless for a long time, her hands still outstretched, as if she could somehow reach out and pull Vincent back into the room to explain himself. But the man was gone, leaving behind only the heavy air of unease and the haunting weight of his words. Is he gone?" Robert asked, his voice shaky as he stepped toward the door. He glanced through the small window beside it, as though hoping to catch a glimpse of the man retreating into the night. What the hell was that about? Valerie didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned slowly, her gaze sweeping over the room as if searching for something that might make sense of the chaos swirling in her mind. Her heart raced. Each word that Vincent had spoken felt like a stone dropped into a vast, unknown abyss. And with each stone, a deeper fear was growing within her, a fear that she couldn't shake. "What do you think he meant?" Valerie finally asked, turning to face Robert. Her voice was tight, almost strained, as though even speaking the words aloud could give them a form of power. "He said Emily wasn't just killed. He said it was orchestrated by someone in this house. By one of us." Robert swallowed hard, his face pale, eyes wide in disbelief. "I don't know, Valerie. But something's not right. This isn't just some random guy showing up with some wild theory. He's not scared. There's something about him. He knows something." The house felt colder now. The warmth of their earlier conversation had vanished entirely, replaced by an oppressive chill. The silence between them grew heavier, broken only by the distant hum of the house's old pipes. Valerie could barely bring herself to speak again. "What if he's right?" she whispered, almost as if she were afraid to voice the thought aloud. "What if one of us?" Her words hung in the air, too terrifying to finish. It wasn't possible, was it? They had all been devastated by Emily's death, devastated by the brutality of it, by the police's cold conclusion that it had been a tragic accident. But now, with Vincent's cryptic words ringing in her ears, she wondered if that truth had been too easy. Too quick. Too clean. "I don't know what to think anymore," Robert admitted, rubbing his face in frustration. He had always been the pragmatist in their relationship, the one who needed tangible proof before he would accept anything. But now, standing in the middle of this nightmare, even he couldn't deny the mounting dread. "I don't trust him, but I can't deny that. I can't ignore the possibility." Valerie's eyes flicked toward Marie, who had remained completely still since Vincent's departure. The older woman had been watching them both, her eyes clouded with fear and guilt. She hadn't spoken a word since Vincent's bombshell, but Valerie could feel the weight of her silence like a living thing pressing down on the room. "Marie," Valerie said quietly, stepping closer. "What do you know?" Marie flinched, her eyes darting toward the ground. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, swallowing hard. She paused, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to say. It's all just so much." The words didn't make any sense to Valerie. All she could focus on was the way Marie had flinched, how her hands were clasped so tightly together that her knuckles were white. Marie was hiding something. Valerie could feel it in her gut, a nagging sensation she couldn't push away. "Marie," Valerie repeated, her voice softer but more insistent this time. "You need to tell us what you know. If there's something you've been hiding, now is the time to tell the truth. We can't keep living like this." Marie's shoulders slumped. She looked defeated, broken in a way Valerie had never seen before. For a long moment, there was only the sound of their breathing, heavy and labored, before Marie spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't an accident," she said, her words chilling the air even further. "I don't know how to explain it, but I knew something was wrong the night she died. I thought I was going crazy. I thought maybe I was just imagining things, but now I'm not so sure." Valerie's heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying? What happened?" Marie slowly raised her eyes to meet Valerie's. There was a glint of something dark in them, something Valerie couldn't quite place. It was fear. It was regret. And it was something worse, something she couldn't identify. "Emily wasn't just taken by some random act of violence," Marie said, her voice shaking as if the words were physically painful to utter. She was targeted. By someone close. Someone who knew her. Someone who knew all of us." Robert's face turned ashen. "What? No, you don't mean..." "I don't know who it is," Marie continued, her voice growing more desperate, "but I know it wasn't a random act. It wasn't some stranger. Someone in this house, someone here, killed her. And I think I know why." Valerie felt a chill run down her spine, and her mind raced. She was torn between disbelief and the horrific possibility of what Marie was implying. What did she mean? Who could have done this? Before she could ask more, the front door creaked open again, and Valerie froze. There, standing in the doorway, was a shadow, a tall figure whose face was barely visible in the dim light from outside. "Who is it?" Robert demanded, taking a protective step forward. And then, with a sharp intake of breath, Valerie recognized the figure standing in the doorway. It was Vincent, the stranger from earlier. "What the hell do you want?" Robert barked, his voice cold. Vincent didn't move. He just stood there, staring at them. His expression was unreadable, but Valerie could see something in his eyes. A glint of something dangerous. Something knowing. "I'm here to make sure you understand the truth," he said quietly, his voice as calm as ever. "And to make sure you can't hide from it any longer." And with that, the room seemed to close in around them. The air in the room grew heavier as Vincent stepped fully into the house. His presence seemed to suffocate the space, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Valerie couldn't quite place what it was about him. Something in his eyes, the way he moved, the certainty in his voice, but it unsettled her to the core. It wasn't just that he was offering answers. It was the way those answers came with a sense of finality, as if there was no other truth but the one he held. Robert moved in front of Valerie instinctively, as though the presence of Vincent alone was enough to make him feel threatened. "What the hell do you want now?" Robert spat, his voice low and menacing. Vincent didn't flinch. He simply stood there, surveying them all with an expression that was as unreadable as it was unsettling. "You still don't understand, do you?" he said slowly, his gaze now fixed on Marie, who had been silent since her revelation. "None of you do. You think this is just about Emily's death? You think you're just dealing with some random tragedy?" Marie, who had been wringing her hands, now looked up at Vincent, her face drawn and pale. "What do you mean?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "What else is there? What could you possibly know that we don't?" Vincent's lips curled into a small, almost pitying smile. "There's a reason Emily's death didn't make sense from the start. It wasn't a coincidence. She was chosen, targeted, and I'm here to show you who did it." The room seemed to pulse with tension. Valerie's stomach twisted as she tried to process his words, but she couldn't keep up. What did he mean, chosen? How could he know this? There were so many questions, but they all seemed to get stuck in her throat. "Who did it?" Robert demanded, his voice hard. "If you know something, you better say it now." Vincent stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Marie's. She backed away slightly, as though instinctively afraid of him. "It was someone in this house. Someone who's been hiding the truth from all of you." He turned to face Valerie and Robert, his voice soft but chilling. "And they've been hiding it for a long time?" Valerie's breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Are you suggesting one of us?" Vincent didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned back to Marie, his eyes narrowing. "You knew, didn't you? You always knew. And yet you said nothing?" Marie's face went ashen. She seemed to shrink under Vincent's gaze, almost as if he were peeling back the layers of her soul. "No, I didn't," she stammered, her hands shaking. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't." But there was no convincing Vincent. He stepped toward her, each movement deliberate and cold. "You did know, Marie. The signs were all there. Emily." Emily had no chance the moment she crossed that line. Someone wanted her gone. Someone close. "Stop," Marie begged, her voice breaking. "I didn't want any of this. I didn't know what to do." "Then why didn't you say anything?" Vincent's voice rose, sharp and accusing. "Why did you let it happen? Why didn't you protect her?" The words hit Marie like a physical blow. She flinched, recoiling as though struck. Tears welled in her eyes, and her hand reached for the chair behind her, gripping it tightly. The weight of guilt seemed to crash down on her, the truth so unbearable that it threatened to shatter her completely. "I didn't," Marie whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I didn't think it would come to this. I didn't know who to trust." Vincent stared at her for a long, tense moment. His gaze was unyielding, as if searching for any hint of deception. Finally, he spoke again, his voice soft but cutting. "You didn't know? Or did you just not care? Did you let Emily die because it was easier than facing the truth?" Marie was shaking now, the weight of her own failure pressing down on her chest. Valerie could see the internal battle raging within her, the conflict between the woman who had been her friend and the one who had failed her niece. Her eyes flicked to Robert, then back to Vincent. There was no comfort in their faces, only the cold truth of the situation. "I couldn't," Marie whispered, her voice almost too soft to hear. "I couldn't stop it." Vincent shook his head. "The truth is harder to ignore now. Emily knew. She knew something was wrong, but it was too late by then. Someone in this house, someone close to her, took her life. And you all helped hide it?" The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to break. Valerie looked around, feeling the walls close in on her. Was it possible? Could someone she trusted, someone she'd known for years, actually be responsible for the death of her niece? She looked at Robert, but he was just as lost as she was. The confusion and fear were evident in his eyes, but beneath it was a growing anger. "We need to know who, Vincent," he said, his voice cold and steady. "Tell us who did this." Vincent looked back at Marie, his gaze hardening. "She knows," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She knows exactly who did it." Marie recoiled as though struck by a physical blow. "No, I don't." But Vincent didn't let her finish. He raised his hand, silencing her, and the room seemed to freeze in place. Valerie's heart pounded as she waited, breathless, for the next revelation. What was he about to say? What truth could possibly be worse than what they'd already uncovered? "It's you," Vincent said flatly, his eyes never leaving Marie's. Marie staggered backward, her face pale as the color drained from her. Her hand trembled, clutching her chest as though she couldn't breathe. Valerie's mouth went dry. She couldn't hear him right, could she? Was he really accusing Marie of this? I didn't, Marie gasped, her voice weak. Vincent stepped forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "You did. You killed her?" Marie's face contorted in disbelief, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she stepped backward, almost tripping over the chair she had clung to moments ago. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the weight of Vincent's accusation too much to bear. Valerie stood frozen, unsure of what to think, her body tense, her eyes flicking between Vincent and Marie. Was this truly possible? Could someone who had been part of their lives for so long be capable of such an act? Vincent's words hung in the air like an unbearable weight, suffocating the room. He didn't even blink as he watched Marie, his gaze piercing through her, as though trying to force her to admit something that she could no longer hide. The silence was deafening, only broken by Marie's frantic, shallow breaths. No, I didn't," Marie whispered, almost pleading, as if she were trying to convince herself rather than anyone else. Her hands were trembling so violently now that they shook at her sides like leaves in the wind. Valerie's stomach twisted with nausea. Her voice, when she finally managed to speak, was barely above a whisper. "Marie, how could you?" Marie's eyes snapped to Valerie's, her expression a mixture of horror and desperation. She opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. She couldn't seem to form any coherent thoughts, let alone explain herself. Vincent, however, had no problem voicing his suspicions. "You couldn't let her get in the way," he said, his voice cold and calm, almost methodical. "She knew too much, didn't she? She started asking questions. She started getting too close to the truth." Marie recoiled from him, her face twisted in anguish. I didn't kill her." Her voice was rising now, filled with panic. I just wanted it to stop. I didn't want any of this. I never meant for her to die." "You didn't mean for her to die?" Vincent asked, his voice suddenly sharp. "Then why did you give her that pill, Marie? Why did you slip it into her drink? You knew it would make her sleep, make her weak enough for them to take her. You knew exactly what you were doing." Marie collapsed to her knees, her body crumbling under the weight of the truth. She was gasping now, clutching at her chest as if the air itself was suffocating her. Tears began to spill from her eyes, but they were not tears of relief, not of guilt. No, they were the kind of tears that came when someone realized just how far they had gone, when they understood that there was no turning back. No, she repeated, shaking her head, her voice hoarse. "I never meant it. I never meant any of this. It was just supposed to be a little push. Just a little push to make things better." The room felt colder now, as though the very air around them had thickened. Valerie stepped forward, her heart racing in her chest, her mind struggling to understand. Marie had been a part of their lives for so long, had been there through thick and thin, and now, this? It felt like a betrayal too profound to process. But why? Valerie's voice cracked as she asked the question. "Why would you do this to Emily? You loved her. She was family." Marie looked up at her then, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Valerie saw something else in her eyes, a darkness that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. Marie's gaze softened for a moment, her lips trembling as she tried to speak, but the words never came. She could only look at Valerie, unable to explain what had driven her to this point, unable to make it right. "You don't understand," Marie said finally, her voice hoarse, as though speaking took everything out of her. "You never understood. She was getting in the way of everything. She was always so innocent, so full of life. And I couldn't live with it anymore. I just wanted to protect myself." Her words were like a slap in the face. Valerie's world seemed to tilt, the room spinning as she tried to grasp what Marie had just said. She had always known Marie to be flawed, to have her own struggles. But this was something else entirely. This was a betrayal of everything she had ever known, everything she had ever believed about the woman who had once been her friend. "I did it for us," Marie whispered, her voice so low that Valerie almost didn't hear it. "I did it so we could live, so I could keep us safe. I did it for me. For my future. Emily was just a casualty. I never thought it would go this far." Vincent stood silently, watching Marie as she crumbled further into herself. His gaze never left her, as if waiting for her to say something more, something that would confirm everything he had suspected. Valerie couldn't take her eyes off of Marie either, but her heart was breaking. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but she was paralyzed. The woman she had once trusted, the woman who had been a part of her life, was no more than a monster in disguise. "So, this was all about you, wasn't it?" Robert's voice cut through the silence, low and full of disdain. He had been standing near the back, watching quietly as the truth unraveled, and now his voice was cold with anger. "You didn't care about Emily at all. You only cared about yourself." Marie looked up at him, her eyes wide and pleading, but there was nothing left to say. Nothing could undo the harm she had done. Nothing could fix the lives she had destroyed. I didn't want this," Marie whispered, her voice trembling. "But I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop myself." The words hung in the air like a curse, suffocating the room as everyone stood in stunned silence, grappling with the truth. The truth that would change everything. The room was heavy with silence, the truth hanging like an oppressive weight. Marie had spoken, but her words felt as though they were trapped in the air, unable to settle. Valerie's chest tightened with the realization of what had been done. It wasn't just the murder. No, it was the premeditation, the chilling thought that Marie had planned Emily's death as if it were nothing more than a necessary step. But the room was not empty of other emotions. There was an undercurrent of something darker, something that neither Valerie nor Vincent could quite name, but it was there. A feeling that something even worse was still waiting to be revealed. Vincent's expression was stone cold, his eyes narrowed in disbelief but still calculating, still trying to piece everything together. He had always been the skeptical one, always the one who questioned, and right now, his mind was racing with all the possible explanations he could offer for this madness. There had to be more. There had to be something deeper than just selfishness driving Marie. Valerie stood motionless, her hands clasped in front of her, trying to hold herself together. Her mind spun, recalling all the little signs she had ignored, all the moments when something felt off. Marie had been there for her, had always been there, but now she felt like a stranger, someone who had never truly been part of her life. "I never meant for this to happen," Marie repeated again, her voice cracking. She had no tears left to shed, her eyes empty and haunted. It just happened. I don't know when I lost control." The room grew colder, the silence thick with tension. No one spoke. The words hung in the air, almost suffocating in their weight. "I want to know why." Valerie's voice broke through the quiet, trembling but insistent. She stepped toward Marie, eyes searching for any semblance of remorse, of humanity, but what she found was a broken woman who couldn't even look her in the eye anymore. "Why Emily? Why her?" Marie flinched at the question. The truth was that she had no simple answer, no words that would make sense of her actions, nothing that could explain the depth of her betrayal. She had killed her niece, someone who had trusted her, someone who had loved her. But how did she explain the darkness that had taken over her mind, that had driven her to commit such an unspeakable act? "I don't know," Marie whispered, her voice barely audible. I couldn't let her keep living. She was too innocent, too good. And I was afraid she would ruin everything I worked for." Vincent's face twisted in disgust. "You think she was a threat? A little girl?" Marie's eyes shot up, finally locking with his. There was no defense left in her, no excuses to make. "I had no choice," she said, her voice now rising in pitch. "You don't understand." She was starting to ask questions. She was getting too close to the truth. "The truth?" Valerie echoed, confused. "What truth? What do you mean?" Marie's gaze darted around the room, like she was trying to find an escape, but there was nowhere to go. She had already confessed. The words she had said hung in the air, irrevocable. The truth was there, But she couldn't bring herself to say it, to admit the depths of her involvement in whatever twisted game had played out. "I was trying to protect you," Marie said, almost pleading. "I was trying to protect all of us. You have no idea how bad it could have been." A cold chill swept through the room, a shiver that ran down Valerie's spine. "Protect us? From what?" Marie's voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible. "From them." "From who?" Vincent snapped, stepping closer, his voice thick with anger. "Who the hell are they, Marie?" Marie's eyes flickered, and for the first time, she looked genuinely frightened. "I shouldn't have said that," she muttered under her breath, taking a step back, as though the words themselves were dangerous. "You don't understand. You won't understand. I thought I could control it. I thought I could stop it before it got worse." "Stop what?" Valerie demanded. "What the hell are you talking about?" Marie's eyes darted to the door, as if she was waiting for something, or someone, to appear. There was an energy in the air now, thick with fear and anxiety. Something had shifted in the room. The answers were still dangling just out of reach, like a cruel puzzle, but the more they pushed, the deeper the hole seemed to get. The truth was not just about a murder. It was about something much bigger, much darker. "Marie," Valerie pressed again, her voice rising in desperation. "What happened to Emily? Tell me." Marie's hand shot out to the side, as if to ward off the question. Her breathing grew heavier, almost frantic, as though she was struggling to contain something inside. "I can't," she said, trembling. "You won't believe me. No one will." But Valerie wouldn't let it go. She couldn't. She needed answers. She had to understand. If she couldn't make sense of it, then Emily would be lost forever. The pieces didn't fit, and it was driving her mad. "I don't care what it is, Marie," she said, her voice breaking but firm. "Tell me the truth. What happened to her? Tell me everything." The silence stretched on as Marie continued to shake, her eyes wide with fear, but this time, Valerie saw it. There was something behind Marie's terror. Something that wasn't just about guilt. Something deeper. Something alive. The atmosphere in the room grew thick with tension as Marie slowly opened her mouth, but before she could speak, there was a sudden knock on the door. The knock on the door was sharp, deliberate, like the sound of an approaching storm. It was impossible to ignore. Valerie froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She had been so wrapped up in Marie's confession, in the horrifying truth that was just beginning to unravel, that she hadn't even noticed how the air had shifted. The room was heavy now, thick with an unnatural tension, a sense of impending doom. Marie recoiled at the sound, her body tensing, eyes darting around as if searching for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. Valerie's gaze locked onto her, trying to read the panic in her eyes, but it only deepened her confusion. "Who's there?" Valerie called out, her voice shaky, almost a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would draw something terrible in. Another knock, louder this time. "Answer the damn door." Vincent's voice was sharp with authority, a commanding presence that had once put fear into the hardest criminals. But now, in the midst of this madness, it was futile. The knock came again. Too quickly, too relentlessly, each strike a reminder that something was on the other side, something far worse than they could have imagined. Marie's breathing quickened, a panic settling over her face. "You have to stop this," she whispered, barely able to form the words. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she stepped back, as though distancing herself from whatever was about to unfold. Vincent's hand tightened around the door handle, hesitating just for a moment before he flung it open, but as soon as he did, a rush of cold air swept in. The darkness beyond the door swallowed the light from the room, and what stood there wasn't human. A figure, tall and cloaked in black, stood in the threshold, its face obscured. The presence was overwhelming, its very essence exuding a sense of something ancient, something beyond comprehension. A deep, resonating silence surrounded it, broken only by the low, guttural sound of breathing, too slow, too deep, too wrong. "You," Marie gasped, her voice cracking as she took a step back. Her body betrayed her as she froze, eyes wide in recognition, her face a mask of horror. No, not you." The figure stepped into the room without a word, its presence enough to send a chill through the air. Valerie's blood ran cold, her instincts screaming to run, but her feet remained glued to the floor. She couldn't move. The figure's head turned, and the room seemed to close in on them, the walls growing tighter, the air thinner. Valerie saw something in the shadows, something flashing, like eyes glinting in the darkness, but it wasn't human. It wasn't even alive. It was wrong. "What is this?" Vincent muttered, his usual bravado gone, replaced with something more akin to terror. His hand reached for his gun, but it felt useless in that moment. "Who are you?" Valerie asked, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving, as if it were waiting for something for the right moment. And then, with terrifying calm, it raised a hand, the fingers long and unnatural, extending slowly toward Marie. "I told you," Marie whispered, as if speaking to herself, her voice hollow. "I told you that you couldn't run from this. No one can." Suddenly, the figure's hand shot forward, grabbing Marie by the wrist with an inhuman strength, yanking her forward. Marie's face twisted in agony, her breath caught in her throat as she struggled against the grip. "Let go of her," Valerie shouted, stepping forward, instinctively reaching for the figure's arm. But her hand stopped short, as though an invisible force had stopped her from getting any closer. A cold wind swirled around her, biting at her skin, as the figure's grip on Marie tightened. Then, without warning, the figure turned its gaze on Valerie, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The sensation was unbearable. Valerie's chest tightened, her heart racing as if it were about to burst. In an instant, the room was plunged into darkness. Every light flickered and died. The silence was deafening. But then came the voices, soft at first, like a whispering wind, but growing louder, sharper, until it felt like they were coming from all directions. They were voices of the dead, of forgotten souls, all crying out in agony. The air smelled of something rotten, decayed. "What is this?" Valerie gasped, but the words didn't feel like her own. They were swallowed by the noise, drowned out by the horrors that seemed to seep from the walls, from the floor itself. The very house felt alive, pulsating with a terrifying force that made the blood run cold in her veins. Marie's screams were the only thing that cut through the chaos, raw and desperate, echoing through the room as if she were being torn apart from the inside. And then, as quickly as it had all begun, everything went silent. The house, the dark, the voices, they all vanished in an instant. The figure stood still, Marie crumpled on the floor, her body limp. The room was bathed in an eerie calm, the air unnaturally still. Valerie knelt beside Marie, shaking her, desperate for any sign of life. Her heart pounded in her chest. The terror still lingered, but it was not the same as before. It had shifted. Something was coming, something far worse than they had ever expected. "Marie, wake up!" Valerie screamed, her voice breaking. But Marie didn't respond. "Marie," Valerie whispered, shaking with fear, but there was nothing left in the woman's eyes. Nothing but an empty stare. Valerie's hands shook violently as she reached for Marie's wrist, desperately trying to find a pulse. She didn't want to believe what her instincts told her, that Marie was gone, that whatever had come through that door had taken her. The figure was gone, vanished into the shadows from whence it came. But the air remained thick, weighed down by an unsettling presence. Valerie looked around, her heart hammering in her chest. There was no sign of the figure now, but she knew it wasn't gone. It was still here, watching, waiting. "Marie," Valerie's voice was a hoarse whisper. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. Every instinct told her to leave, to run, but she couldn't. She had to stay. She had to find answers. But the room was empty now, too empty, as if the walls themselves had drawn inward, squeezing her in. And then, just as suddenly as the silence had overwhelmed them, the lights flickered. Twice. The buzzing noise overhead was erratic and chaotic, struggling to find balance. Finally, they went out entirely, plunging the room back into darkness. Valerie stood frozen, her heart beating so loudly it drowned out everything else. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, the sense of being watched so overwhelming it felt like her skin was crawling. And then the voice came. It was soft at first, like a breath, no louder than a whisper, but unmistakable. "You've seen too much." Valerie froze, her body going stiff with fear. She couldn't tell where it was coming from, couldn't see anyone. The words seemed to be coming from the very walls, reverberating through her mind, as if they were imprinted on her very soul. What do you want?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Who are you?" But the voice didn't respond with words. Instead, it was replaced by a terrible, piercing sound, like the crackling of fire, distant yet all-consuming. It grew louder, and then a shape began to form before her, emerging from the shadows, the air around it shimmering like a mirage. A figure, tall and indistinct, its face hidden by a dark hood. It moved slowly, gliding effortlessly toward her. Every step it took seemed to distort the space around it, warping the very reality Valerie knew. Suddenly, Marie's body jerked. The lifeless shell of her friend twitched and then began to writhe uncontrollably, her back arching unnaturally, as if her body was being pulled by invisible strings. Valerie stepped back, her breath catching in her throat, unable to look away. "No!" Valerie gasped, taking a step forward. But Marie's body didn't stop. It only continued to twist and convulse as the room seemed to darken further, as though the very walls themselves were closing in on her. The figure moved closer, and now Valerie could see its face, or rather, the absence of one. It was a smooth, blank surface, an absence of humanity where a face should have been. Nothing but a void. "You shouldn't have opened the door," the figure rasped, the voice low and guttural. It echoed through the room, filling every inch of space, reverberating in Valerie's skull. "Now, you will pay the price for your curiosity." "No!" Valerie cried out, her voice breaking as her body trembled. "Please, what do you want from me? What are you?" The figure took another step forward, and Marie's body ceased its violent writhing. It lay still again, but Valerie could see her fingers twitch, like a faint, desperate attempt to escape. And then, her eyes snapped open. The eyes that met Valerie's were no longer Marie's. They were dark, empty, hollow. Like a void. Like nothingness. The terror in those eyes was unbearable. "You've done this," Marie's voice rasped, but it was distorted, unrecognizable. It was the voice of something far worse, something that should not have been. The figure reached out, and as it did, Valerie stumbled back, her hands desperately clawing at the walls for support. The figure's hands stopped just inches from her face, and for a brief, fleeting moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The air grew colder. The sound of Marie's voice turned into a sickening screech, echoing through Valerie's ears like nails on a chalkboard. The figure's face, if you could call it a face, twisted in mockery, as if the very concept of human pain and suffering delighted it. "You will never escape," it whispered. And before Valerie could scream, the world around her spun into oblivion, darkness swallowing her whole. The last thing Valerie heard was Marie's voice, no longer the sweet voice of her friend, but a cold, hollow echo, one that carried with it the weight of 1,000 souls. And then, there was only silence. Nothing but the creeping shadows.